There's a hobby that many Christians have picked up. Simply this: they love to study the signs of the return of Jesus in the Scripture. And then when they see the signs, they try to match them up to the current events, and they're watching the current events to see what's happening. And then they love to speculate as they try to put the two together as to when and how Jesus will return. Now, some of the people that do this actually love to create a panic among other Christians. And they often will tell us that we need to drop everything we are doing. We need to focus on these signs and current events, and we need to warn everybody out there about the return of Jesus. Well, I think we're going to be surprised this morning when we look at Matthew 24 that Jesus' wisdom regarding the signs of his return is just the opposite of some of these that I will call obsessionists with the return of Christ and how to handle this. I want you to turn to Matthew 24 this morning. Please look in your Bible. My hope and prayer is that you leave with God's word today and not Pat's sermon. And there are some amazing passages and things here in Matthew 24. It's called the Olivet Discourse. Well-known passage of Jesus speaking about the signs of his return. The context, we've been studying the last few weeks. Jesus just left the temple. It's still Tuesday. He had just finished with some debates with the Pharisees, and they've been going back and forth, and the religious leaders. And he just left the temple. On the way out of the temple, his disciples that were walking with him, they looked back at these massive, gorgeous temple buildings, and they pointed out the buildings to Jesus. Listen to this in verses 1 and 2. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly, I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down." So in the next verse, this raised three questions in the minds of the disciples. And it says this: and as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Three simple questions. When are these things going to happen, Jesus? What's going to be the sign of your return when you're coming? And what's going to be the sign of the end of the age? Those are the questions that set the context to this chapter and really form the outline to the chapter in the way that Jesus answered, because Jesus answered their questions and chronologically laid out for us the timetable that you see of his return and what's going on. He'll start by answering the question, when will these things happen? And it's broken up into three sections here. And he starts with the birth pangs. And I want you to look at verse 8. You might want to circle this if you're the kind that likes to circle in your Bible like I do and mark it. Right at the end of verse 8, you're going to see the word birth pangs. That's the heart of what's happening in verses 5 to 8. That's the theme of that section. Then starting in verse 9, you see the word tribulation. You may want to circle the word tribulation because that's the next thing. And that section he's going to talk to all the way about down to verse 14 about the tribulation. Then if you go down to verse 21, you'll see it says, "For then there will be a great tribulation." You might want to circle the word great tribulation because that's the theme of verses 15 to 28, the great tribulation. So Jesus, when he gives them when these things will happen, the timetable, he talks about the birth pangs, the tribulation, and the great tribulation. And then he's going to talk about the sign of his coming, their second question. And in verse 30, you'll see he talk about the sign of the Son of Man. Now, as we look at this, the sign of his coming is referring to the return of Jesus Christ, not the rapture of the church. Because at this time, the rapture of the church, they didn't really understand what that was. So we've got to think back in their thinking. As the disciples were talking with Jesus, they were thinking about the second coming, the return of Jesus to earth to set up his kingdom. And then finally in verse 31, we see that Jesus talks about the end of the age. So he answers their three questions. When these things will happen, the sign of his coming, and the sign of the end of the age. And then in verse 32 of chapter 4, he says, so you too, now learn from the parable. And starting in verse 32, all the way through chapter 25, Jesus takes a sidebar as he talks about the application of these signs and what they mean for you and me today. So that's what this chapter is all about and where it's going to go. So I'm just going to take you through it and then focus our time on what it means for you and me. He starts off answering the question, when will these things be? And we saw from verses 5 to 8, he's talking about the birth pangs. Let me read that. Starting in verse 4, Jesus says, see to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you're not frightened, for those things must take place. But that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all of these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Just the beginning. What Jesus is talking about here is the time we're living in right now. We're living in the season of the birth pangs, and we see many of the things that Jesus talks about happening as we watch the news and read the papers today. But then in verse 9, he talks about another time period called the tribulation. And he starts with the word then. There's a big transition from this big national scene and events that happen in the world to very personal with the people then. And then he says this, then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you. And you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, at the time of the tribulation, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Now, we're not in this time period right now. We're in the period of the birth pangs. The tribulation hasn't started. We can certainly see the atmosphere being developed in the world around us that this will easily be moved into, but we know from the Bible that two things have to happen before this time of the tribulation. First of all is the rapture of the church, where the church of Jesus Christ, the true believers, will be taken out of this world because we have not been destined for wrath, but for salvation. But the second thing that happens, we know from Daniel, is that a peace treaty has to be reestablished between Israel and one of their enemies that will establish peace in the land of Israel. Neither of those have happened yet. We're not in this time period, but it's something that's yet to come. But then there's a period, according to Daniel, and you know what? I'm referring to Daniel real quick this morning because we studied through that book a few years ago. So I'm not going to try to go back and do all that because that's not my purpose today. If you're interested, you might want to look up the notes online or order the tapes. But we've laid out a lot of this as we went verse by verse through Daniel. But so as we walk through this passage and look at this, we're going to see a lot of these things we talked about. So in Daniel, he talked about there'll be 3.5 years where there'll be basically peace. But in the middle of that 3.5 years, something is going to happen that Jesus refers to in verse 15. And he says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. In other words, what he's saying here is this. In Daniel, we learn the abomination of desolation is when the Antichrist takes his place in the temple on the seat to receive worship as God. And Jesus is referring to that time. And he says, when that takes place, when this Antichrist actually goes in and desolates the temple by sitting on the throne in the place of God and receiving worship, he says, then in verse 16, he says, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Moves from tribulation, or very difficult time, to a time and 3.5 years in, the Antichrist takes his seat in the temple, receives worship. Then there's going to be a tribulation like this world has never seen nor ever will see. It's going to be the worst time this world has ever experienced. And he says in verse 22, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. I think it's interesting here in verse 24, during the birth pangs, during the tribulation, and during the great tribulation, in every one of those he says there's going to be false prophets, false teachers, false religions, false presentations of who the Christ is and how to follow God and walk with him. And so false teaching is gigantic in every period of time, and Jesus tells us to beware of that. But I think especially, and I see the atmosphere for this being developed here again as we move into the tribulation period that's yet future, is that the false prophets during this time will be performing great miracles and signs. Signs and wonders will be taking place from those who claim to be speaking for God, and there'll be false teachers that are able to work miracles. And then he says in verse 25, behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. When the lightning flashes from the east and the west, it happens suddenly and everybody sees it. Nobody will miss it. And he said, hey, Jesus over there, he's in the wilderness. You know, the Messiah's like, no. He says, when Jesus comes, everybody will know it, and it's going to be sudden. It'll be like that flash of lightning that goes from the east to the west in the sky. You can't miss it. And then he says, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. What does that mean? I have no idea. Then Jesus turns to the sign of his coming. And he starts in verse 29 by starting to set a time frame. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, he's going to talk about the sign of the return of Christ. When's Jesus coming back? What's the sign of his coming? Well, we know we're in the period of the birth pangs. There's yet the tribulation to happen. Halfway through, we know the abomination of desolation is going to take place with the Antichrist in the temple. And then there's going to be this period of time that is just like the world has never seen. And then he says here in verse 29 that immediately after this time of the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. You know what the sign of the return of Jesus is? It's the return of Jesus. That's the sign. It's going to happen immediately after the tribulation. The heavens, there's going to be great things that happen. The sun, the moon, and the stars. And then all of a sudden, coming on the clouds of heaven, we'll see Jesus returning to the earth to set up his kingdom. That's the sign. And then he tells us about when is the end. He answers that in the next verse, verse 31. Now, before I read verse 31, let me remind you of something. First of all, the end of the age, and I'm taking you back in your mind to Matthew 13. Those have been with us as we worked our way through the parables of the kingdom. Jesus said, to you it's been known to know the secrets of the kingdom. And during those secrets of the kingdom, he said, during this time, that there's going to be this period of time where the wicked and the evil are going to live together in the kingdom of God in the form that it's taking at this time. And that at the end of that time, Jesus said in the parable of the wheat and the tares, that the angels are going to do a reaping. And they're going to come together. First, they're going to take out the sons of Satan, and they're going to take them where they'll be burnt with fire. And then he's going to take the sons of the kingdom, and they're going to enter into God's kingdom. And so the end of the age is characterized by a time when the angels come, and they separate between all the people that are there on earth at that time, those that are sons of Satan and those that are sons of the kingdom. And this is what he says in verse 31. Here's the sign of the end of the age. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. And in Matthew 24, Jesus answers the question of the disciples. When will these things happen? What's the sign of the return of Jesus? What's the sign of the end of this age? And the end of this age then begins the start of the kingdom of God on earth, where Jesus will sit on his glorious throne. In a couple of weeks, we'll see that in Matthew 25 as he continues on and talks about that time. But then Jesus makes a big transition. It's a sidebar, as I said, where Jesus takes a sidebar from this chronological presentation and answering their questions, and he takes us into the schoolroom to learn a couple things from this. It's the time of application. And we're going to start it this week to look at the application of this, but then we're going to take another look at it next week and really the week to come on what all this means for you and me. So in verse 32, Jesus says this. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. What Jesus is saying simply is this. When you start to see all these signs that I talked about happening, you can know that the return of Jesus is near. We can know a general sense of the season of the Lord's return. God's word has revealed that to us. He's not left us in the dark, so we can see a general sense of when things are developing and when he'll be returning. He said, just like that branch on the fig tree, when you see that it's become tender and it's giving forth the leaves, you know summer's near. In the same way with us, when we see all these signs happening, we know the season of the Lord's return is near. But then he says this in the next verse, verse 36. But of that day and hour, of that specific time, no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. The coming of Jesus is going to be like the days of Noah. What were the days of Noah like? It was a time of judgment. And what happened is that even though Noah was a preacher, and much as we go around telling people and warning them about the judgment yet to come, nothing changes. They keep living life just as usual. They keep eating and drinking, keep on getting married and giving on marriage. Nothing changes. They just keep on living, ignoring God's word and what God has to say. And just like in the days of Noah, until the flood came and the judgment came, they didn't even understand it until it was upon them. And that's the way it's going to be with the return of Jesus. The world is going to be in the dark. They've been warned, but they don't listen. They're turning a deaf ear to God's word, just as Noah was warning in his day. And the only ones that responded were his family. People are being warned today, and people will be warned during the tribulation about the return of Jesus and the judgment yet to come. But nothing's going to change. Life will be as usual. They'll just keep on living as they do, and they won't get it until it's too late. And the judgment's already upon them. Then there will be two men in the field. One will be taken, one will be left. That judgment will come, and here it is, the end of the age, the reaping of the angels. One will be taken, I believe, away to judgment. One will be left to enter into the kingdom. Two women will be grinding in a mill. One will be taken away to judgment. One will be left to enter into the kingdom. And then we come to verse 42. The big therefore. Therefore is the practical implications. Therefore is always there to tell us, we've been learning whatever it is up here. Therefore it says now, in light of this, the conclusion, the practical implications that come out of what we learned before, and this big therefore, as I call it, what Jesus is saying to us right here, is that in light of the fact that we can know the general time and season of the Lord's return, but nobody can know the very specific day and hour of his return. Therefore this, he says, be on the alert. For you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready. Disciples, brothers and sisters at Moraine Valley Church, for this reason, you also must be ready. For the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think that he will. It's very clear here. He says in verse 42, be on the alert. Verse 43, if the head of the household known what time they're going to break in, he would have been on the alert, would not allow his house to be broken into. Verse 44, for this reason you also must be ready. What's the practical implications of the fact that we know that there's a general sense of the time of the Lord's return, but not the specific day? He says this, be alert and be ready. That's what Jesus says, be alert and be ready. But he doesn't leave it there, because now he tells us how we can be ready. I love this. This is where I'm going to camp this morning for you and me. Verse 45. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave? Here it is. How am I going to be ready for the return of Jesus? How am I going to be alert? Who's the faithful servant? Who's the wise one? Who's sensible? That's what Jesus, that's where we're at right now. Jesus is going to tell us, this is how you can be ready for his return. This is how you can be alert. This is how you can be a faithful and wise slave of Jesus in the midst of a season when we know he's coming back, but we don't know exactly when that is. And this is what Jesus says. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave, whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Did you catch that? The one who's ready, the one who's faithful and sensible, is the one who's doing God's will for their life. Whether that's raising up your family and moving to Mexico, spending 2 years of transitions and 20 years of your life, because that's God's will for Aaron and Christy Hemphill. But what's God's will for you and me? Because for some, it's to feed your babies and change their diapers at the time that you were assigned to. I love the fact that the illustration that Jesus used, who's the faithful and sensible slave? He didn't say, he's the one that sells everything he has and gives it to the poor. He could have said that. You know what he said? He said, it's the cook. It's the cook. It's the cook who I said, feed my family at the time. When I left, I said, you know what I want you to do? I want you to make sure that my family eats at the proper time every day. Cook their food. Jesus says that's the one who's the faithful and sensible. When he comes back, he finds that person doing what he told them to do. Whether it's to move to Mexico to bring the gospel, or it's to change babies' diapers and feed them on their schedule, and everything in between. I don't know about you, but that brings me great comfort, and great excitement that I can be ready and wise and faithful to God just by doing what I'm called to do. Not by dropping everything and selling everything and focusing on the signs and warning everybody else, but rather by doing God's will for my life. And then I love this reward. Listen to this in verse 47. Truly I say to you. Now you need to know everything Jesus says is true. This is his way of highlighting. This is his way of putting a bold on it. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. Isn't that awesome? You know what Jesus is saying? If when I come back, I find you doing what I told you to do, and you're faithful in that little thing of just cooking the food for the family and having it on the table at the right time, I'm going to trust you with big things in the kingdom. Because when I come back, I'm going to put you in charge of all my possessions. Jesus is saying, proven faithfulness in small things to him right now will result in entrusted big things in the kingdom of God. Are you guys encouraged by that? I am. I mean, this is unbelievable. God, if I'm just faithful to what you call me to do, right here on earth, whether it's big or small, you are going to give me a gigantic reward. Proven faithfulness to small things right now will result in God entrusting us with big things in his kingdom. So let me speak to a moment to you and me. If you don't know Jesus, don't put it off. Yeah, we can look and say, we know the season. We're only in the birth pangs. We're not tribulation, great tribulation. You know, I got time, put it off. We don't know when the rapture is going to happen. That could happen today. But even outside the rapture, every one of us don't know when we're going to die. Some of us could actually die tonight in our sleep. And you know what, guys? This isn't a time to delay. God desires that everyone would come to the knowledge of our Savior, Jesus Christ, and put his faith in him. And I'll encourage this morning, as John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world, God so loved you, who may be here this morning and you don't know for certain in the heart of your hearts that you know Jesus. You need to know that God so loved you that he sent his son Jesus to die for you. That if you would believe in him, you won't perish but have eternal life. I got to encourage you today, if you don't know where you stand with Jesus, we're going to have some people up front here afterwards. Don't leave this place without settling it. We'll help you understand what that means and looks like. How about those of you, there's people here who are believers. They've trusted Jesus. But I want to speak first of all to the believer who's living no different than the world. As Corinthians says, living like a mere man, like somebody that doesn't have Jesus living in them. Somebody they call a carnal Christian. You know Jesus, but you're not walking with Jesus. You're running your own life by your own rules, by your own way and your own power. You're your own boss, not Jesus, even though you're a believer. What do you need today to be a faithful and wise servant being ready for the return of Jesus? Romans 12 tells us, therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living, holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. First thing you need today, stop living for yourself. You know Jesus. It isn't just your ticket for heaven. Jesus has called you to follow him with all your life and to love him with all you have. And if you're here today, your need is to come before Jesus and offer yourself to him and say, Lord, you know what? I'm giving myself to you this morning as a living sacrifice to no longer live for myself, but for him who died for me. Then there's a second thing. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind by this book, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. You know the next thing you need after you present yourself to Jesus to live for him? Start getting in this book and letting the words of this book enter into your being. And I'm not talking about just go to church on Sunday and hear a sermon. I'm talking about on your own. Memorize this book, meditate on it, read it daily. Let these words enter into your being. Let them go deep down and change the way you think, transform you at the core of your being. Then you'll know what the will of God is for your life. As the Spirit of God personalizes this word for you and speaks to you through his word about what God wants for your life, and then that will of God, which is good, which is way better than what you're trying to accomplish in your life, and acceptable and way more acceptable and way more perfect than anything you can ever have by running your own life. Just want to tell you this morning, don't put it off. Get ready. Get ready. And then those of you who are followers of Jesus, who long with all your heart to be a faithful and sensible servant. I know there's a lot here. That's why I love being the pastor of Moraine Valley Church. There's a lot of people here that long with all their heart. I want to be ready. I want to be that faithful and sensible servant. What does God's word say to you today? Well, I want to encourage you. So you know, I say, what's Pat going to give me to do today to be a good enough Christian? I want to encourage you with something. And what I call this day and age of the radical Christian. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Well, let me say this. I think many of us are feeling beat up. Many of us feel shame. Many of us feel like second-class citizens in this day and age of the radical Christian. By that I mean this, the call to sell everything and give it away to follow the Lord. The call to do something extraordinary. The call to stop wasting your gifts and your potential. And you know what the greatest fear of people like this is? Is being an ordinary person with a non-glamorous job, and here's the worst, living in the suburbs, having nothing extraordinary about your life. Guys, there's a lot of books and preachers out there, and I'm not saying they're wrong. Please, I'm not going against them today. I want to give a little sanctifying tweak to what we're hearing, because I don't think we're hearing the whole story. Because many of us are starting to judge ourselves and others on this standard that if we don't do something extreme and something extremely radical and something way out on the edge and risky, that somehow we're the second-class citizens of the kingdom who are not walking with God fully. I want to read you a couple verses. I want to encourage you guys this morning with something. Listen to what 1 Thessalonians 4 says. But we urge you, brethren, to excel still the more and make it your ambition. Listen to this. This is God's word just as much as Jesus' words to that rich man said, sell everything you have and follow me. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life and attend to your own business and work with your hands, just as we command you, so that you will behave properly towards outsiders and not be in need of anything. That's God's word. Make it your ambition. A quiet life. Working with my hands. Minding my own business. How about this next verse? Titus, so that you may encourage young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be sensible, pure, workers at home, kind, being subject to their own husbands so that the word of God will not be honored. So look at what he says to young men. Likewise, I urge young men to be sensible. In all things, show yourself to be example of good deeds, with purity in doctrine, dignified, sound in speech, which is beyond reproach, so that the opponent will be put to shame and have nothing bad to say about us. And listen to what he says to all of us with whatever we do. He's talking to slaves, which really an equivalent application for us today would be any employee. In all things, obey those who are your masters, your boss on earth, not with external service, as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord, rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It's the Lord Christ whom you serve. What are you doing? You're working for Southwest Airlines? What are you doing? Do it with all your heart as unto the Lord rather than man. That's being faithful to God, if that's what God has called you to do. So here's my definition of a radical Christian. Well, let me say this before I say that. What God is saying to you today, for most of us, we need to bloom right where you're planted. doing whatever God has called you to do. And some of you, he will call, like Aaron and Christy, to do the extraordinary things. But we need to be careful about putting that as the standard of a good, vibrant Christian. This is my definition of a radical Christian. Pete, that is it. It looks so much like a passage of scripture. I thought, man, and this is just my definition. I was waiting for it to come up. I say, where's my stuff? This must be really good. This is my definition. That's what PBP stands for. With all your heart, living out God's word wherever he has placed you. Doing whatever he calls you to do, seeking always to excel still the more, which will result in you making a radical impact upon the people in your world. Guys, that's a radical Christian. Living out God's word. This is how I say it in a quick nutshell. A radical Christian is not someone who does something radical, but really someone living radically for the Lord right where you are. Paul says, make it your ambition. Bring the full life of Christ as described in his word to the place that you live, go to school, work, play, whatever it is. And if you're living fully for Jesus in that place doing what he wants you to do, you're a radical Christian.